In the past couple weeks, one of the big phrases that's been talked about a lot has been systemic racism. And there have been people who have said racism isn't a system. I'm not racist. I don't have an individual approach where I view others as racist. And the pushback against that is that racism doesn't have to be something that you are actively participating in through what you think or say or do. But racism is the way that systems in our culture and society are designed to advantage certain people based on the color of their skin and disadvantage others. When we look at the Bible, we see that that's actually true. We don't need to look at that sociologically. We can actually see just from scripture alone that systemic racism is a problem. So today we're going to look at that. We're not going to talk about what systemic racism looks like in America today. We're just going to look at why we can see in the Bible that systemic racism is a problem and why systemic racism is more than just a structural problem, but is actually something that is supernaturally charged, that there's a demonic force behind systemic racism. As I say that, the way we talk about demons, the way we talk about race, all of that is sort of filtered through our modern categories. So we're going to dive into all that today and talk about spiritual beings, Satan, demons, the powers, the principalities, racism, ethnicity, sin. We're going to talk about a lot. So we're going to move today. Racism is more than just the individual choices of individual humans. And the reason that's true is that sin is more than just the individual choices of individual humans. One of the great shortcomings of Western theology, of Catholic and Protestant theology, is that it emphasizes the individual's relationship to God without talking sufficiently about our corporate reality and our relationship to God as ethnic groups, as different other groups, and then as the whole human race. Thinking of sin as only a problem for an individual is a very Western way of thinking. We also need to think of sin as something that is a corporate problem. That's the way the Bible presents sin. You do sin individually. You do need to recognize that what I do is not in alignment with God, and we need God to solve that. But we also sin corporately, and that's a huge, huge, huge idea in the Bible that is completely missed by most evangelicals and most Protestants and Catholics in general. And I think there's actually something connected between European white culture and the fact that the church has not talked about this enough. And I'm not sure which causes which. I suspect that it is the wrong theology for thousands of years that has created Western culture to be so individually centered, and that even people who aren't religious, aren't Christian, have a very individualistic way of understanding their own culpability and responsibility. The Bible does not give us that pass that easily. We have to understand that sin is something that's corporate, not just individual. And that's going to be one of the main things we'll be looking at for the rest of this series on the people of God. You do sin individually, but groups of humans sin. And there is a real hidden spiritual power behind that sin. Not only do groups of humans sin, but the entire human race sins. And as we'll see today, the power of sin is most clearly tied to ethnic division, or what we call racism in modern language. Now, we're going to cover a lot about spiritual beings and how we understand Satan and demons. I could probably talk about this for hours and hours and still not cover it well enough. So I'd like to encourage you to pause this video and click on this Bible Project video about the divine council, about the sons of God, and understand how did the ancient Hebrew people understand the spiritual beings, the sons of God, the nations. Check that out really quick and then come back. Now that you've watched this video about how Hebrew people in the Old Testament understood the powers or the divine council or the spiritual beings or the sons of God, we can move forward and begin to understand what the Bible actually says about ethnic division and why ethnic division is one of the primary ways that spiritual warfare is actually made manifest in our physical world. Last week, we looked at the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, and we talked about how Acts 2, when Pentecost happened, is the reversal of the Tower of Babel. And we looked at that just from a human societal way of understanding Genesis 11, that the Tower of Babel was all of humanity trying to take God's place. But the Bible actually goes into the Tower of Babel much more deeply than that. The Tower of Babel becomes a key text in understanding the Old Testament, understanding the people of God. And when we look at Genesis 1 through 11, we see that there are multiple descriptions of the fall of God's perfect creation. Genesis 3 is the story of individuals choosing to do things their way instead of God's way, Adam and Eve. In Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, or actually it was also the Tower of Babylon, and we need to keep that in mind today. The Tower of Babel is the Tower of Babylon. The Tower of Babylon is the story of the whole human race choosing to do things that benefit themselves instead of benefiting God. And so right there, we see that sin is not just an individual problem, but a corporate problem. The weirdest story to us about the fall of creation, the fall of heaven and earth, and neither heaven or earth are the way they're meant to be, is found in Genesis 6. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then Yahweh said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." So we read the flood story after that. But here's this weird story about the sons of God, the daughters of men, and the Nephilim. There are the sons of God, those who belong to the category of Elohim. We talked a few weeks ago about how Elohim, the word that we get God from, doesn't just mean God, the God. It's a category for anything that is spiritual. Just like you and I are human beings, and humans are kind of animal, but we are far superior to all the other animals. We are like the animal. In the same way, God, Yahweh, the God who created all of heaven and earth, he is of the category of a spiritual being. And the word Elohim, or God, in Hebrew really just means a category of those belonging to the spiritual realm. And Yahweh is by far the best of those. He is so much better than the other spiritual beings. It's like comparing us to ants. Yes, humans and ants are both animals, but we are on a completely different plane from them. In the same way, Yahweh is on a completely different plane from the spiritual beings. In Genesis 1, God makes the heavens, which is the spiritual realm, and he makes the earth, which is the realm where we live, the physical realm. On day 4 of creation, God creates spiritual beings to bring his shalom to the spiritual world. And then on day 6, God creates human beings to bring his shalom to the physical world. But we've already talked about how in Genesis 3 and 11, the human beings, the rulers that were supposed to bring shalom to the physical world, we screwed up. Here in Genesis 6, we're reading about how the spiritual beings, the rulers of the heavenly realm, who are meant to bring shalom to the spiritual world, they also screw up. And what they do is they fail to do their job. All of these stories of the fall are about God's shalom bringers, God's assistant rulers, failing to do their job. And they're trying to do things that aren't their responsibility. So Adam and Eve eat the fruit because they want to take the role of God. They want to be the king instead of his vice kings, his assistant rulers. In Genesis 11, the people build a tower so they can exalt their name to the realm of the spiritual beings. They want to build a name for themselves. And that's not their job. The spiritual beings are supposed to deal with heaven. The human beings are supposed to deal with earth. They don't know their role. Stay in your lane, know your role, humans. But it turns out that the spiritual beings did the same thing. The spiritual beings wanted to give immortality back to the human beings. And they wanted to cross this line between heaven and earth. That wasn't their responsibility. They were called to rule the spiritual world. God is a God who chooses to delegate his power. He wants to share his power, his shalom bringing, with the spiritual beings and with the human beings. And we all fail. We all end up doing the wrong thing. So the spiritual beings who fall become known as the powers or the princes or the principalities. And they do the wrong thing. They bring real personal spiritual power that is negative into our world, into the physical world, and into the spiritual world. And human beings do the same. We fall and we bring real power that is fallen, that's broken into our world. And where there's this overlap between the two is the Nephilim, and that's where the idea of the demonic comes in. So Jesus deals with all of this in the New Testament, and the New Testament writers write the stories of Jesus casting out demons and dealing with powers and principalities, specifically to address the fact that he is taking all of this on. See, sin is not just an individual problem. Sin is complicated. This is probably confusing to you in many ways. I had to spend years thinking about this. I had 2 degrees in studying the Bible before and I still didn't get this. I still had to keep studying it, and it finally clicked for me. I pray that as you think about this, that you would come away with the idea that sin is deep, that it is more than we can understand, that we can't just fix things in our own power. We need Jesus to come and set us free. So the flood comes, and the flood in Genesis 6 comes because humans are murdering each other. If you read Genesis 4 and 5, the reason why God has problems with the way the world is specifically because of violence in cities. But then when you read outside of the Bible, the other things that Jewish people were thinking about the flood, and then this passage in Genesis 6 is alluding to those stories. The other reason God sends the flood is because the spiritual world is a mess too. So Genesis tells us the story of how humans and spiritual beings fall together. And God says, you two deserve each other. You two are both not bringing shalom. You're both not staying in your lane. You're both not doing what I meant you to do. Neither of you are being the image of God. The spiritual beings were created to reflect God's glory. Sun, moon, and stars are bright lights. The spiritual beings were meant to reflect the glory of God. And human beings were meant to be the image of God in the earth. And none of us are doing it. None of us are identifying the image of God in others and elevating it. So God says, you two deserve each other. So there's this really weird passage in Deuteronomy 32. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples, according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. So we talked last week about some of the words for people and nations. And I'm going to always point these out to you just so you can, over the weeks, get the hang of how often these words are used. It says, when the Most High, Elyon, that's one of the names of God, gave the nations their inheritance. And that's the word goy, nation, people, ethnic group. When he gave the nations their inheritance, the goy, their inheritance, when he divided all of mankind, he divided the sons of Adam. He set up boundaries for the peoples, and that's this other Hebrew word, am. That means people, ethnic group, nation, family. And he set up boundaries for the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, most of the most reliable ancient manuscripts actually don't say sons of Israel here. They say sons of God or sons of Elohim. And that's a significant discovery. So the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, said sons of God. We've known that for centuries. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the middle of the 20th century, and they also say sons of God, sons of Elohim. And when you can look at all of these ancient copies that we have of the Bible, we discover that it's more likely that originally the author of Deuteronomy 32 said that God set up the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So we saw this weird phrase, sons of God, back in Genesis 6 also. What does that mean? Does that mean that God, Yahweh, has children in addition to Jesus? There are some offshoot Christian groups who think that, but that's not what's talking about here. We don't use the phrase sons of to categorize people that often, although there are a few phrases you can probably think of that we use the phrase son of to talk about the person, not who their parent is. But in Hebrew, there are some times where sons of is a way of designating somebody as part of a class. So right here in Deuteronomy 32:8, it talks about the sons of humans, the sons of Adam. And that's, yes, means that we're children of Adam, but what it's really saying is we're of the category of humans. And in the next sentence, Deuteronomy says the sons of God. So we have two categories. We have the sons of Adam, in other words, those who are called to bring shalom to the earth. And then we have the sons of God, in other words, those who are called to bring shalom to the heavens. They're of the category of spiritual beings. As I think about phrases that we use in English that are like this, the phrase sons of anarchy comes to mind. If you've read C.S. Lewis, if you've read the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and all the rest of the books, C.S. Lewis calls humans sons of Adam and daughters of Eve. And I think he actually understood these passages properly, and that's why he said that. We are of the category of human. So in Genesis 6, the sons of God, those who belong to the spiritual category, end up coming down and intermingling with the daughters of man. And there's this intermingling that's not supposed to happen. And so God says in Deuteronomy 32, he's giving over the sons of Adam, the humans, to the sons of God. So God sees that all of the spiritual beings and the human beings have failed. And he says, you two deserve each other. So he gives each nation its own God. This is fascinating. Often when we read the Bible, we just read about the idols being false gods. But here in Deuteronomy 32 and in other places like in the Psalms, we encounter this idea that there are real spiritual powers behind those idols. There are real gods, real Elohim behind those idols. And the nations are tied to them. And in fact, the way the New Testament talks about it, the nations are enslaved to those gods. Every ethnic group is enslaved to a god. This is really weird because we don't talk about it much. We fail to see this in the Old Testament, but it's all over the place in the Old Testament. It's all over the place in the New Testament. The Old Testament calls this category of being, it calls them gods, it calls them princes, rulers, authorities, powers, and principalities. So much that's said about them. One of the most interesting descriptions of these gods, these spiritual beings, is in Isaiah 14. And usually when we read Isaiah 14, we think it's about the fall of Satan. But it's not actually about the fall of Satan. It talks about the fall of the king of Babylon. Now, Babylon is the same place that the Tower of Babel was built. And in fact, when you read Isaiah 14, I want you to keep in mind the story of the Tower of Babel, where human beings built this tower, this ziggurat, a Babylonian tower, into the heavens, into the spiritual beings' space, so that they could build a name for themselves. The human beings wanted to elevate themselves to the role of the gods and to the role of God. So what does this chapter say in Isaiah 14? The Lord will have compassion on Jacob. Once again, he will choose Israel and will settle them in their own land. Foreigners will join them and unite with the descendants of Jacob. Nations will take them and bring them to their own place, and Israel will take possession of the nations and make them male and female servants in the Lord's land. They will make captives of their captors and rule over their oppressors. So in this passage in verse 2, it says the nations, which is actually the word or peoples or families, they will bring Israel back to its own land, and Israel will take possession of them. Israel will incorporate all of the peoples into itself and rule over them. So this passage is saying that the unique people of God, this whole sermon series around is called the people of God, Israel, the unique people of God, will incorporate all of the nations into itself. So the people of God will be expanded into a multi-ethnic people, not just an ethnic, unique, distinct people, but a multi-ethnic family. As we've seen in the New Testament in Galatians, the greatest proof that Jesus is king is that there's one unified multi-ethnic family. This is prophesied here in Isaiah 14, verse 2. Israel will incorporate this multi-ethnic group into itself, into the people of God. On the day the Lord gives you relief from your suffering and turmoil, and from the harsh labor forced on you, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. Now the question is this talking about the literal king of Babylon, or is this talking about Satan? Those are the two main ways this passage is interpreted. This is the taunt. How the oppressor has come to an end, how his fury has ended. The Lord has broken the rod of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, which in anger struck down peoples with unceasing blows, and in fury subdued nations with relentless aggression. All the lands are at rest in peace. They break into singing. Even the junipers and the cedars of Lebanon gloat over you and say, now that you have been laid low, no one comes to cut us down. The realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you. All those who were leaders in the world, it makes them rise from their thrones, and those who were kings of the nations. They will all respond. They will say to you, you also have become weak as we are. You have become like us. All your pomp has been brought down to the grave, along with the noise of your harps. Maggots are spread out beneath you, and worms cover you. This is looking forward to the day when the king of Babylon, whether this is talking about the human king of Babylon or maybe Babylon itself as represented by its king, the empire, it could be talking about the individual, it could be talking about the system, or it could be talking about the spiritual power behind the system. And in fact, this is actually talking about all of the above. This passage is talking about the individual king of Babylon, and it's talking about the whole nation of Babylon, which we could call the systemic or structural Babylon. And this is talking about the spiritual power behind Babylon. This is what the people say as Babylon is brought down into the grave, brought to the place of death. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth. you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. Mount Zaphon was a place where they believed heaven and earth came closest, where they overlapped. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, like Elyon, which we read about in Deuteronomy 32. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Usually people think that Satan was a specific angel or worship leader in heaven who said, I will elevate myself to the place of Yahweh. And they get that from this passage. That's one of the main ideas about Satan that we have in Western culture. I think Dante and John Milton read this passage, and so we have this idea of Satan from Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno, books like that. And this is talking about a spiritual power, but when you pay attention to the idea of building a tower and ascending to the top of it to make a name for yourself, what does that call to mind? And this is talking about the king of Babylon. We have to go back to the Tower of Babylon, the Tower of Babel. See, this passage is talking about humans, individuals, and the power structures they're part of. This is talking about individual sin, systemic sin, and it's also talking about supernatural spiritual powers behind them. The king of Babylon represents the literal human king of Babylon, the individual. It represents the nation of Babylon, which we can think of as systemic or structural issues, and it represents the spiritual powers behind them. When we have a Old Testament worldview that incorporates both heaven and earth, the spiritual and the physical, we can understand that racism and imperialism are great expressions of a fallen heaven and earth. If heaven and earth are both fallen, then what that looks like is nations being given over to spiritual powers. And then all of that being broken and causing domination and trying to have conquest and conquering over people who aren't like me, based on my ethnic group, based on where I live, etc. There's a quote that's been going around a lot from Nelson Mandela. It says, no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. I think this is a true quote, but it's also missing something. It fails to address the spiritual power behind racism, behind ethnic division, behind nationalism and imperialism, that I want to make you part of what I'm a part of. Colonialism. No, there's something deeper to this. There's a spiritual, supernatural power. And we see this when we look at the New Testament, that Jesus came to address this problem, not just to address the problem between you and God as an individual. Jesus came to address the problems between nations and between peoples and our bondage to the supernatural powers that keep us in chains. He wants to set us free and make us part of his new people. So let's check out Ephesians. Ephesians really hones in on this concept. And we have this framework that we've been exploring today. I know it's new and you might not feel settled in it yet, but as you explore this framework, you will come to read Ephesians in a very different way. Let's check out Ephesians 3, starting in verse 8. Although I am less than the least of all the Lord's people, this grace was given to me, to preach to the Gentiles, to preach to the ethnos. That's the word that means nations or ethnic groups. The boundless riches of the Messiah. Paul's commission in life was to preach the message of the Messiah, the King of Israel, the King of all peoples, to the nations, and to make plain to everyone the administration of this mystery, which for ages past was kept hidden in God who created all things. His intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms, according to his eternal purpose that he accomplished in the Messiah, Jesus our Lord. Remember in Isaiah 14, it talked about there would come a day when Israel would take possession of the nations, when all of the ethnic groups would be brought into the people of God. But there would no longer be a single ethnicity to this people. There would be a multi-ethnic family. And this was the day that was coming. And talked about the powers that wanted to elevate themselves, the spiritual and human powers that want to elevate themselves into the place of God. And so the human powers are enslaved to the spiritual powers. Paul says his commission, the reason that Paul is doing anything, his whole call in life, is to proclaim the mystery of the victory of the King, to the nations, to the Gentiles. You don't have to live in this way of the Old Testament anymore, where you're enslaved to the powers, you're enslaved to the principalities, the authorities, the rulers. Paul's entire life's work, what Jesus has set him apart for, is to proclaim to the nations and to the powers who are enslaving them, Jesus is king now. You don't have any power here anymore. Let's look at the next chapter, in chapter 4. Ephesians 4, verse 7. But to each one of us, grace has been given as the Messiah apportioned it. Each one of us has been given a scoop of God's gift. Each one of us gets a measure of God's gift. This is why it says, when he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people. What does he ascended mean except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions? He who descended is the very one who has ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. So the Messiah himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of the Messiah may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of the Messiah. Remember in Isaiah 14, it talked about how the individual, systemic, and spiritual Babylon were all thrown down into the place of death. So humans are enslaved to real spiritual powers, and they're part of systems of wanting what's best for my people and not your people. That's sin. That's structural sin. I want what's best for my people instead of your people. And Jesus comes and he descends to this place of death, and he comes out with captives. What this is talking about is Jesus going to war with the powers. Through his death, Jesus descends to the place where the dead are, where the humans and spiritual beings are in prison and living in opposition to the way of God. They're living in death instead of shalom. Jesus descends there. He makes war against the powers, and he captures people who belong to those powers. And he brings them out, and he makes them part of his people. All of us are born enslaved to the powers, enslaved to money, sex, and power, enslaved to racism and imperialism and nationalism, all of these isms. And Jesus comes not just to make you right with God, but to rescue you from your slavery to these powers and to set you free. And when he does that, he brings many gifts to his people. These are where spiritual gifts come from: the apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And Jesus uses these people who he's set aside within his people to help build his people into the family that he wants them to be. He wants to bring us into unity. I know we've covered a lot today. We've gone through all kinds of strange theology, and some of it you're unfamiliar with. But what I want you to take away from this is that rather than getting in an argument about whether structural and systemic racism is a problem in America just based on sociology and your personal observation of things, just look at the Bible. One of the main storylines of the Bible that we've neglected is that sin is more than just a problem inside of me that I need to fix and that I need to have God fix. Sin is something that is systemic, that is corporate. And it's not only systemic and corporate among humans, there are real spiritual powers underneath all of that who are empowering it and causing it to happen. And Jesus did not just die on the cross for you. I know a lot of evangelical Christians want to say, if I was the only person, Jesus would have died for me. That's a terrible hypothetical thing to say. Jesus didn't just die on the cross for you. Jesus died on the cross to set people free, and not in some abstract way. No, we are in bondage to the powers, and we need Jesus to come and make war with them and set us free. We've recently finished a series on 1 Corinthians 15. We were talking about the new creation, and in that chapter, we read that Jesus must reign until he has put all authority under his feet. That's talking about this same thing. Jesus must reign, he must rule until structural and systemic sin are done with. Jesus must rule until both the earthly structures and the spiritual powers behind them are fully defeated and destroyed. And since this enslavement to the powers has to do with specific ethnic and people groups being connected to a specific spiritual being, it's evident that one of the most blatant ways in which we are participating in the fallenness of heaven and earth is through racism. And you may not be actively racist, but all of us are part of systems that favor people based on their nationality, based on their ethnicity. And that's clear from the Bible, let alone what we can see by studying our society. So what do we do about this? First thing I want you to do is just acknowledge that this is a biblical reality. And then secondly, get educated. Find out what are the systemic and structural issues in our world. If you know how to Google anything, you can learn about this. I think one of the problems is that we're lazy and we don't want to take the time to look things up. Look it up. There's plenty of resources about learning about structural institutional problems in America. Learn about redlining in U.S. history. Learn about the GI Bill in U.S. history. Learn about how schools are funded based on property taxes and how that all ties together. Learn about all of these things. Just Google systemic racism, Google some of these things I've just said, and find out what they mean. Because this isn't just some abstract stuff we're reading about in the Bible. This is how spiritual warfare looks in our society. This is what the demonic, the powers and principalities look like in our society. It's not just about creepy, spooky stuff. There are real world, tangible expressions of these powers that are making a mess of our society. So I pray that you would realize that Jesus has set you free and that you would listen to what Paul has to say in Ephesians 3. God's intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. The way we make this wisdom of God known in the heavenly realm is by participating in what God is doing in the earthly realm. We work for justice. We correct the wrongs. And it's through prayer. It's through taking down the authorities that are in the spiritual realm. Let's be part of God's commission to the church to make known the power of King Jesus.